In October of 1917, Vladimir Lenin and his Bolsheviks seized control of Russia, establishing communism throughout the land. It then took a further civil war to rid the nation of opposition to the new government. This period of Russian history stirred up excitement, fear, and most of all, change for the people that lived in the vast country. And the Russian people, like any other group in history, like to sing about their experiences. Allow me to introduce you to the evolution of Russian music from the pre-revolution days of the 1800s to the turbulent years of the revolution and beyond. When it came to classical music, Russia was late to the party. For hundreds of years, many of the Russian czars had rejected Western influence in almost all forms, but it would eventually slip, then flood into the nation. This allowed for Russians to experience classical music, whether to listen to it, if you were rich, or write it, if you were rich and talented. In general, the most well-known compositions from this era of Russian history are Dance of the Sugar Plum Fairy by Tchaikovsky, Prelude in C-sharp minor by Rachmaninoff, and The Flight of the Bumblebee by Rimsky-Korsakov. This music has intense resemblance to Western classical music, but the moodiness, the Russian feel is there. One important note of significance here is that this music was generally only available to the middle and upper class, which made up less than 20% of the total population, and even most of those people could rarely view performances and such. But the 80% of Russians that were peasants, they had no grand symphonic pieces to listen to, but they had folk music. Although folk music was not incredibly influential or important during this era of Russian history, it would soon play an incredibly important part. In 1905, the situation for Russian workers and peasants was deteriorating at an alarming rate. This propelled Father Gapon, a peaceful priest, to lead a group of workers and their families to Tsar Nicholas's Winter Palace. They had a petition with them, kindly asking for fairer working conditions as well as democratic representation. On their way to the palace, the petitioners sang "God Save the Tsar," cementing themselves as peaceful protesters who still lived for the autocracy. After all, God had placed the Tsar there for a reason, they believed. Unfortunately, unknown to them, the Tsar was not even at the Winter Palace, and instead they were greeted by 10,000 members of the Imperial Guard. The guards tried to break up the protesters, which failed, so they promptly fired upon them. This event would be known as Bloody Sunday, and tarnished any remaining reputation Tsar Nicholas II may have had at this time. And it led to the 1905 revolution, seeing mass strikes and civil unrest that dominated the nation for the next 2 years. A symphony was written about these times of hardships in the 1950s, and by none other by Dmitri Shostakovich, the great Soviet-era composer. The symphony is nearly 1 hour long and does an excellent job at recreating the aura of unrest that blanketed Russia during the 1905 revolution. The first movement of the piece begins quietly, so quiet it is discomforting. The strings play chilling chords with the trumpet occasionally interjecting to add to the unsettling feeling. The timpani plays a very important part in this movement. Its harsh but toned down voice foreshadows the brutal events of Bloody Sunday. The second movement begins as the petitioners approach the Winter Palace, with the guards standing menacingly against them. A full orchestral build-up leads to several climaxes throughout the start of the piece. This is then followed by a march-like snare solo that continues on for quite some time. The troops are approaching, until eventually the strings stab into the air, once and again, faster and faster, showing just how bloody Sunday was. The third movement brings the symphony to a relative standstill, starting on low-string pizzicato notes that bring back the discomforting and quiet feeling from the beginning of the symphony. This then builds into a funeral march, grieving the victims of the 1905 revolution. those who suffered to bring change to their nation. The third movement eventually reaches a climax, with the strings gravely soaring through a beautiful but grim melody. A great defeat had been handed to the Russian people by the end of the revolution. They did not take it kindly. The fourth movement represents this discontent. The people had come to their Tsar out of love on Bloody Sunday. Hadn't God put him there to save them when they were in need? Yet the Tsar had failed in saving them, or even showing up, and so much of the lower class believed that they had no Tsar. An ear-piercing combination of woodwinds and brass is then heard, resembling the blood-curdling screams of 100 million Russian peasants and workers. A theme of angry orchestral magnitude that crashes into the audience's ears and does not stop quickly. It continues on, refusing to end without a fight. However, after only a few minutes, it is abruptly cut short, bringing us back to an eerie section much like the first movement, with the oboe cautiously assuming the melody. It is not long until the rest of the orchestra slowly comes back, with the timpani jolting us back into a devilish-sounding brass theme. The mallet percussion finally gets their chance in the spotlight, only for a tocsin bell to take the forefront as this Vex movement finally reaches a climactic finish. I'm not quite sure what to say exactly, other than the fact that this piece of music is marvelous. Absolutely fantastic work, and very representative of the historical events preceding and during the 1905 revolution. After Lenin and the Bolsheviks seized control of the Russian government in October of 1917, music did not immediately change. It did not immediately go from large-scale symphonies, only to be enjoyed by the rich, to the proletariat workers' songs heard during Soviet times instantly. One major change, or rather several major changes in Russian music during this period, was that several notable composers left the nation. Rachmaninoff never returned and Prokofiev departed to America, but came back 2 decades later. This exodus came at an initial blow to the country's music, but the void was quickly filled by, as Marx and Lenin would have called them, the proletariat. These common workers and farmers filled the gap left by many of the grandest composers of the time. And so, as a result, the music of Russia changed drastically over the next decade. The first song I will be analyzing here is actually of Polish origination, a little socialist hymn known as The Whirlwinds of Danger. It is your usual revolutionary song, speaking of raising defiance to the czars and plutocrats of the world. Its main significance for this era is that it became a song sung by the Russian people. Newly liberated workers sang this revolutionary song ecstatically throughout the streets. Wouldn't you, if you finally had a sense of control over your life? Of course, as we know, Soviet Russia would soon turn into the brutal, totalitarian state as the Soviet Union. But at this moment, communism was looking real nice, and these types of songs were a way to express that. Second song I have is known as Farewell of Slavianka. Slavianka meaning Slavic woman. This is one of the most popular Russian marching songs and saw great use during the October Revolution. It is a very booming and triumphant song, with one version that tells of a Russian wife listing her soldier husband's accomplishments, and another version from the soldier's point of view. It is overall a very powerful song that reflects Russia during 1917 and many years onward. In general, these two pieces of music reflect the now aggressive mood of the Russian people after Lenin's revolution. After the Bolsheviks seized power and established Soviet Russia, there were many that opposed this new government. Together they formed the White Army, a coalition of capitalists, less radical socialists, World War I generals, and many others. They did not recognize Lenin's government, and so, war. Now, both sides wanted to win this war, of course, and so many forms of propaganda were used to achieve this. and it is always human nature to remember a message through a catchy song. And so both the Whites and Reds worked to produce music for their war effort. The Whites based one of their war hymns on a recruitment song from World War I. This song is known as March of the Siberian Riflemen. The song is about defending Siberia and her natural beauty. It is an inspiring yet dark song to remind the men of the White Army of why they fight. The Reds, using the same melody as from March of the Siberian Riflemen, created their own song to motivate their soldiers, called the Partisan Song. The lyrics are relatively similar, except for the whole communist thing, of course. But other than that, the main difference is that the Reds sing of pushing eastward to the stronghold of the White Army, with the Whites singing of the other way around. In the end, the Reds won, pushing the White forces from Crimea to Chita, and finally the farthest reaches of Russia, where they eventually surrendered. After the White Army eventually fizzled out in the depths of eastern Siberia, Bolshevik forces vigorously strangling them, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, also known as the Soviet Union, was established. Lenin led this new nation for a year until his death, and was replaced by Joseph Stalin. Stalin was quick to isolate the USSR from Western influence, and so this once more shaped the music of Russia. The Soviet Union cultivated many young composers and musicians, and gave them great opportunities for them to grow their works, but censorship was also rampant. This was not just the totalitarian Stalin, however. Lenin also said, "We are communists, and we must not stand with folded hands and let chaos develop as it pleases. We must systematically guide this process and form its result." By that, he meant non-communist, anti-government music would be banned. Stalin would take this to a whole new level. Through his signature socialist realism policies, Stalin oversaw a major change in Russian culture and music. Many musicians and artists that did not conform to socialist realism mysteriously disappeared for plainly obvious reasons. Shostakovich, composer of the 1905 symphony, was almost a victim of this. After Stalin had briefly viewed one of his operas, a newspaper article was published brashly criticizing that opera. Many of Shostakovich's friends had disappeared during the recent years, and so he was expecting the worst from this. However, he was spared all but humiliation and a setback that would take him until the 60s to recover from. In general, under the Stalinist regime, you either complied or were punished. Shostakovich being one of the lucky ones that merely got a slap on the wrist. To conclude, Russian music during the 1800s was split between the poor peasants, who had their folk music, and the rich upper class, which could enjoy entire symphonies. After the 1905 revolution, the music of the people began to get angrier with more demands. Then the 1917 revolution smacked the nation and everything changed. Soviet Russia was established and the music of the people was triumphant, but there was still a threat, the Whites in Siberia, and so a bloody civil war was fought, with each side chanting the same melody. The Reds eventually made it on top and were quick to censor any music that could pervade the communist system of the newly formed USSR. And so through the toils and hardships of revolutionary Russia, new music may have been born, but the old never truly died.